We dated for 10 months without spending money and built something stronger than any expensive restaurant could have. Bridget Callahan was standing in line at Corner Crust Bakery on a Tuesday morning at 7:45, holding a stack of torn historical blueprints she'd taken home to repair over the weekend, and her phone was pressed between her shoulder and her ear while her sister Sarah talked at her about professional networking and intentional dating strategies. And Bridget was only half listening because she was also trying to calculate if she could afford both coffee and a muffin or if she needed to pick one. 31 years old, historical archivist for the city of Portland, Oregon, and she spent 40 hours a week in a basement office at City Hall, restoring century-old maps and land surveys and tax ledgers, documents that were literally disintegrating from age and improper storage. And her annual salary was $38,000, which meant after student loan payments and rent, she was living on about $800 a month. The bakery was one of those places that survived on being cheap and convenient rather than trendy. Linoleum floors and plastic chairs and a laminated menu board that hadn't been updated since probably 2008. And the line moved slowly because there was only one person working the register, and she was also making all the drinks. Bridget shifted the blueprints to her other arm, and Sarah's voice in her ear was getting more insistent, talking about this new dating app called Elevation that cost $100 a month but filtered matches by income and education level so you didn't waste time on people who weren't serious about building a future. And Bridget was trying to find a polite way to say that sounded like the worst thing she'd ever heard. I'm just saying, Bridget, you're 31 and still going on coffee dates with guys who show up in graphic tees and split the bill down to the penny. Maybe it's time to invest in meeting people who've actually invested in themselves, Sarah said. And Bridget could hear her sister's baby crying in the background, which meant Sarah was probably pacing her pristine suburban kitchen in yoga pants that cost more than Bridget's grocery budget. The subscription fee filters out anyone who isn't financially stable, and the algorithm matches you with professionals in similar income brackets. You could actually meet someone with a retirement account. Bridget finally made it to the front of the line and held up one finger to the barista while Sarah kept talking. And she ordered a small black coffee because that was $2.50, and adding a muffin would put her over $5, and she needed to make the $20 in her wallet last until Thursday when she got paid. The barista rang her up, and Bridget pulled out a $5 bill that was folded into a tiny square from living in her coat pocket. And Sarah was still going on about professional standards and intentional partner selection, and Bridget felt something in her snap. Sarah, I appreciate that you want to help, but I am literally repairing 100-year-old city maps with Scotch tape and printer paper because my department has zero funding. I have $43,000 in student loan debt from getting a master's degree in archival science, and I cannot pay a $100 monthly subscription fee to sit across from a guy who expects me to split a $200 tasting menu, Bridget said, and her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, but she was so tired of having this conversation. Please, can someone just date me for free? Like actually free, no expensive dinners or wine bars or escape rooms that cost $60. Just free, no expectations. No performing financial stability I don't have. The barista handed over her coffee with a sympathetic look that suggested she'd heard every word, and Bridget took it and stepped aside to wait for sugar packets. And Sarah was doing that thing where she got very quiet, which meant she was offended, and Bridget could hear her taking a deliberate breath before responding. I'm just trying to help you find someone who's on your level, Bridget. But if you want to keep dating guys with roommates and broken cars, that's your choice. I've got to go. Emmett's crying. The line went dead, and Bridget stood there staring at her phone, feeling like she just failed some test she didn't know she was taking. And she shoved the phone in her coat pocket and grabbed 3 sugar packets from the condiment station. I know a municipal greenhouse that's heated to 75 degrees in the winter and costs exactly $0 to walk through, a voice said from directly behind her. And Bridget turned around and saw a guy who'd clearly been standing in line close enough to hear her entire phone conversation. And her first reaction was embarrassment, followed immediately by annoyance, because she didn't need some stranger offering commentary on her dating life. The guy was probably mid-30s, wearing canvas work pants that were covered in sawdust and what looked like a climbing harness around his waist with carabiners clipped to it, heavy work boots that were scuffed to hell, and he was holding a battered travel thermos. I have a 7-year-old kid who lives with me full-time and a broken transmission budget. So free is exactly my price range. If you're serious about the no-cost thing, I get off shift at 3, and my sister has fin cover today. The Hoyt Arboretum greenhouse is open until 6, the guy said, and he wasn't smiling like this was a pickup line. His expression was completely neutral, just stating facts. Bridget blinked at him, trying to process whether this was the weirdest interaction she'd ever had, or actually kind of perfect, and she looked at the climbing harness and the sawdust. Do you work for the city? Are you a tree trimmer or something? Municipal arborist. I do tree surgery and hazard removal for the Parks Department. Spend most of my day 60 feet up with a chainsaw, clearing dead branches before they fall on someone, he said, and he shifted his thermos to his left hand and held out his right. I'm Gideon. My kid's name is Finn. He's 7 and obsessed with beetles. Lives with me full-time since his mom moved out of state 2 years ago. And I heard you tell your sister you wanted to date someone for free, which is honestly the most realistic thing I've heard anyone say about dating in about 5 years. Bridget shook his hand and his palm was rough with calluses, the kind that came from years of physical work. And something about the directness of this whole interaction made her want to laugh. I'm Bridget. I work in the archives department at City Hall. I spend my days repairing historical documents in a basement with terrible ventilation and, yeah, I genuinely cannot afford to date the way everyone seems to expect people to date. I'm broke and tired, and if one more guy suggests splitting an expensive brunch, I'm gonna lose it, Bridget said, and Gideon nodded like this made perfect sense to him. So is that a yes on the greenhouse, or do you need to think about whether taking free date advice from a stranger at a bakery is a good life choice? Bridget looked at this guy covered in sawdust with a broken transmission budget, offering her a date that cost $0, and she thought about Sarah's $100 a month dating app and the last 3 dates she'd been on, where guys had suggested wine tastings and theater tickets and axe-throwing venues that all required money she didn't have. And something about Gideon's complete lack of performance felt like air after being underwater. Yeah, okay. Greenhouse at 3:30. How do I find you? Do you want my number, or are we just hoping we both show up? They exchanged numbers and Gideon ordered a plain bagel. And when the barista asked if he wanted anything else, he said no because he had coffee in his thermos and had already packed his lunch. And that one detail told Bridget more about his financial situation than any dating profile ever could. She grabbed her blueprints and headed out to walk the 4 blocks to City Hall, and on the way her phone buzzed with a text from Gideon that just said, Hoyt Arboretum, main greenhouse entrance. I'll be the one still covered in sawdust. See you at 3:30. The rest of her day was spent in her basement office using archive-quality tape to repair tiers in an 1896 land survey map, and her supervisor stopped by around 2 to tell her the department budget had been cut again, and they needed to start rationing supplies, which meant Bridget was going to be doing even more repairs with even less materials. And she spent an hour after that just staring at boxes of deteriorating documents, wondering how she was supposed to preserve a city's history with Scotch tape and hope. At 3:15, she packed up and took the bus to the Arboretum, and when she walked up to the greenhouse, Gideon was already there, leaning against the building exactly as advertised, still covered in sawdust, drinking from what looked like the same battered thermos from this morning. You actually came. I was maybe 50-50 on whether you'd decide this was too weird, Gideon said, and he pushed off the wall and opened the greenhouse door for her. And the wave of humid warm air that hit them was immediate and intense after the cold November afternoon outside. The greenhouse was this beautiful glass structure filled with tropical plants and the sound of a small fountain, and there were maybe 3 other people wandering through looking at the displays, and it smelled like earth and growing things, and it was completely free. They walked through the paths between raised beds, and Gideon pointed out different species, explaining the difference between a Pacific dogwood and a western red cedar like he was giving a casual lecture. And Bridget found herself actually interested instead of just politely listening. How do you know all this? Did you study horticulture, or do you just pick it up on the job? Bridget asked, and Gideon stopped next to a young oak tree and ran his hand over the bark. Mostly on the job. I've been doing tree work for 12 years. You spend that much time up in canopy, you start to actually see the trees instead of just the branches you're cutting. learn their patterns, how they grow, what they need. Bridget told him about her work restoring historical documents, about the 1870 city directory she was currently reassembling page by page, and Gideon listened with actual attention instead of that polite, waiting for their turn to talk thing most people did. They spent an hour and 20 minutes in the greenhouse and didn't spend a single dollar, and when they finally left because it was getting close to closing time, Gideon walked her to the bus stop. So that was probably the lowest budget first date in Portland history. If you want to do it again, there's a free walking trail along the river, or we could just sit in my truck and watch the rain. I'm extremely flexible on free activities, Gideon said. And Bridget smiled because this felt more honest than any date she'd been on in years. Yeah, I'm in. Free is my new favorite price point. Text me when you've got time, and we'll figure out another $0 adventure, Bridget said. And she got on the bus and sat in the back watching the city pass by her window. And for the first time in months, she felt like dating might actually be possible if she could find someone who understood that broke wasn't a character flaw, it was just a reality. And maybe Gideon, with his sawdust and his broken transmission, was exactly that person. What started as one surprisingly decent greenhouse walk turned into about 6 weeks of Bridget and Gideon figuring out how to date on exactly $0. And they got creative in ways that felt more like collaboration than deprivation. Meeting at the riverfront trail after her shift to walk 3 miles while Gideon pointed out which trees were diseased and needed removal. Or sitting in the bed of his truck in empty parking lots watching thunderstorms roll across the West Hills because the view was free and neither of them had anywhere else they needed to be. They'd discovered early on that their schedules aligned weirdly well. Bridget worked 8 to 4, and Gideon usually finished his route by 3, and the hour or so before he had to pick up Finn by 4:30 from after-school care became their window. Late December hit cold and wet when Gideon showed up at City Hall on a Friday afternoon to meet Bridget after work, and she came out the side entrance to find him leaning against his truck, looking more beat down than usual. And when she got closer, she saw he had rope burns on both forearms, angry red welts that looked painful. What happened? Did you fall? Bridget asked, and Gideon shook his head while pulling his sleeves down to cover the burns. Nah, my main climbing rope is fraying, and I put in a requisition for new rope 2 months ago, but the department budget is frozen. So I've been using it anyway, and it slipped through my hands today when I was descending. Friction burned straight through my gloves. Bridget grabbed his wrist gently and pushed the sleeve back up to look at the damage, and the burns were worse than he was making them sound, deep enough that the skin had broken open in places and would take weeks to fully close. You can't keep using frayed rope. That's how you die. Literally, that is how arborists die. I've read the OSHA reports. And Gideon pulled his arm back with this expression that was half embarrassed, half defensive. I know, but the requisition's been stuck for 2 months because budget is frozen, so I'm stuck with this one for now if I'm careful. Bridget looked at him and realized he was doing the same math she did every month, deciding which necessary expense could be delayed because the money wasn't there yet, and she understood that calculation intimately. Bring your requisition paperwork to my office Monday. I work with city records all day. I know how to file a formal safety incident report that legally obligates the department to respond within 30 days. A standard requisition gets buried, but documented safety reports have teeth, Bridget said, and Gideon looked skeptical. You work on paper and maps. This is a workplace safety issue. Bridget shrugged. All of it is paper at the end of the day. The question is which paper forces action. Monday afternoon, Gideon showed up at her basement office with the damaged rope over one shoulder and his requisition paperwork in hand, and Bridget looked at the sheath damage and told him it needed to be retired immediately. I know, Gideon said. I'm not climbing on it. She cleared her work table and spread out the paperwork instead, walking him through filing a formal safety incident report through the city's risk management system, documenting that he had flagged the rope as a hazard 2 months ago with no departmental response. This creates a legal obligation to act, same principle as an archival damage log. You are forcing them to acknowledge the gap between what they require you to do and what they fund you to do it with, Bridget said, moving through city forms with the same practiced efficiency she used on everything. It is genuinely terrifying that you know how to weaponize city paperwork, Gideon said. They filed the report together, and Gideon coiled the retired rope to hand off to his crew, lead as evidence. That might actually get me new rope by February. You just saved my neck using documentation instead of thread. Not sure which is weirder, Gideon said, and he was coiling the rope carefully, and Bridget was filing the copies into her system when he paused. Hey, I noticed your cutting tools are all dull. Those scalpels and knives you use for trimming documents. They're not cutting clean anymore. I've got whetstones in my truck from sharpening my chainsaw blades. If you want, I can sharpen all your tools. Probably take an hour. Bridget looked at her collection of archival cutting tools, the scalpels and mat knives and specialized trimming blades. And yeah, they were all dull because the department didn't have budget for professional sharpening services, and she'd been making do with increasingly ragged cuts. You know how to sharpen precision blades. I thought you just did chainsaw maintenance. And Gideon pulled a whetstone kit from his messenger bag. Sharp is sharp. The principle doesn't change. You want a specific angle on the edge, and you work through progressive grits until it's clean. I smooth burrs off my carabiner gates with a fine file to keep them from wearing through rope. Your scalpels aren't much harder. Same idea of getting a clean edge. He sat up at her work table and went through her entire tool collection methodically, testing each blade and then working it across the whetstones with this focused precision. And Bridget watched him work while she organized archival boxes, and something about the quiet companionship of them, both just doing practical tasks in the same space, felt more intimate than any expensive dinner could have been. When he finished 40 minutes later, every single one of her cutting tools was razor sharp, and he cleaned the metal filings off her work table and packed up his stones. Try them out. See if the angle's right for your work. I can adjust if they're too aggressive, Gideon said, and Bridget tested a scalpel on a piece of scrap paper, and it cut so cleanly it barely made a sound. Early January, Bridget got a text from Gideon asking if she wanted to meet Finn. His kid had been asking who his dad kept texting, and Gideon figured it was time to see if they could exist in the same space without it being weird. And Bridget said yes, even though meeting a 7-year-old felt like a significant escalation. They met at the Hoyt Arboretum on a Sunday afternoon because it was completely free for everyone. And Finn was exactly what Gideon had described. Skinny kid with his dad's dark hair and an intense focus when something interested him. And right now what interested him was a fallen log covered in beetles and decomposing bark. Finn crouched down next to the log, examining the insects crawling through the rotting wood, and said without looking up, "Do you think they know they're helping the tree turn back into dirt, or do they just think they're eating lunch?" And Bridget crouched next to him to look at the beetles. "They probably don't think about it like we do. They're just following their instincts to find food. But yeah, they're definitely helping break down the wood so it becomes soil again." Finn seemed satisfied with this answer and moved further down the trail looking for more beetles, and Gideon hung back, letting Bridget and Finn explore the arboretum together. And after about 20 minutes, Finn turned to Bridget with this very serious expression. "My dad says you work in a basement with old papers and maps. Do you have any old bugs, like preserved ones from a long time ago?" Finn asked, and Bridget thought about the collection they had in the archives. "Actually, yeah. We have pressed plant specimens from the 1920s that sometimes have insects preserved with them. Beetles and moths that got caught in the pages when they were being dried. I could show you sometime if your dad says it's okay." Finn's entire face transformed, and he looked at Gideon. Can we go see the old bugs? Please, I promise I'll be quiet and not touch anything." The following Tuesday, Bridget arranged for Gideon and Finn to visit during her lunch hour, signing them in at the security desk as research guests, and she pulled out one of the botanical specimen folders from 1924 and carefully showed Finn the pressed flowers and the small beetles that had been inadvertently preserved with them. And Finn asked about 60 questions in 15 minutes, and Gideon stood back watching Bridget handle his kid's intense curiosity with this patient, methodical attention, answering every question seriously, and he felt something settle in his chest. This recognition that Bridget's careful, precise way of moving through the world was exactly what his chaotic, single-parent life had been missing. February came in with budget meetings and bureaucratic nightmares, and Bridget got called into a city council session on a Thursday morning where they announced departmental cuts, and her supervisor pulled her aside after and told her the archives department was losing 40% of their funding, which meant they couldn't afford the climate-controlled storage in City Hall anymore. "They're moving us to the auxiliary storage facility on Marine Drive. It's cheap warehouse space. We have to be out by March 1st, her supervisor said. And Bridget felt her stomach drop because she knew that building. It was an uninsulated metal structure near the river that flooded every winter, completely inappropriate for archival storage. She spent the next week trying to fight the decision, writing emails to council members and department heads explaining that you can't store 100-year-old paper documents in a damp warehouse, that moisture would destroy everything they'd spent decades preserving, and every single response she got was some variation of, "We understand your concerns, but the budget shortfall requires difficult choices." By the third week of February on a Friday, Bridget was sitting on the concrete floor of the new storage facility during her lunch break, and the space was exactly as bad as she'd feared, cold and damp, and she could already see condensation forming on the metal walls. And boxes of irreplaceable historical documents were stacked on wooden pallets, waiting to absorb moisture from the ground. She pulled out her phone and stared at her messages with Gideon, and he'd texted that morning asking if she wanted to grab sandwiches from the food carts and eat in his truck, and she started typing a response and then deleted it, started again and deleted it again, because how do you tell someone that your entire life's work is about to rot in a warehouse and you have no power to stop it? Finally, she just typed what she was actually feeling. "I have nothing to offer right now, Gideon. Everything I've built is being thrown in a damp warehouse to rot. I'm empty. I just need to be alone." She hit send and put her phone face down and sat there in the cold warehouse, surrounded by boxes of history that she was watching get destroyed in real time. And she felt like every careful repair she'd ever made was pointless. Every preserved document was just delaying inevitable decay. Gideon was 60 feet up in a massive oak tree in Laurelhurst Park when her text came through, and he didn't check it until he'd descended to the rigging platform his crew had built below and clipped his tether to the anchor point. And then he pulled out his phone and read her message twice. He didn't text back immediately, and he didn't call her. He just stood there on the tree platform his crew had built and looked down at the ground where they'd felled a massive old-growth cedar earlier that morning, a tree that had been damaged in the windstorm and was dangerous enough that the city had ordered its removal. The cedar trunk was lying in sections on the ground, each piece probably 12 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. Beautiful, tight-grained wood that would normally get chipped and mulched, and Gideon's brain shifted into the same problem-solving mode he used when he was diagnosing tree disease, and he pulled his phone back out and texted his crew lead, asking if anyone had claimed the cedar lumber for personal use yet. Saturday morning came in gray and drizzling, the kind of northwest rain that wasn't dramatic enough to cancel outdoor plans, but persistent enough to make everything damp and miserable. And Bridget was sitting on the concrete floor of the Marine Drive storage facility at 9 a.m., surrounded by cardboard boxes of irreplaceable city records that were already starting to absorb moisture from the cold ground. She'd come in on her day off because sitting at home thinking about her job falling apart felt worse than actually being here watching it happen, and she'd spent the last hour just pulling random documents from boxes to check their condition, finding water stains forming on ledgers from 1892 and maps from 1906 that were developing the soft edges that meant the paper was breaking down. The facility was basically a large metal warehouse with a concrete slab floor and roll-up loading dock doors, and it smelled like mildew and diesel from the city maintenance vehicles that were stored in the adjacent bay. And there was no climate control beyond some industrial fans that didn't do anything except move the damp air around. Bridget had brought her personal dehumidifier from home and plugged it in, but it was designed for a bedroom, not a 5,000 square foot warehouse. And watching it try to combat the moisture was like trying to empty a swimming pool with a teaspoon. She was seriously considering just quitting, finding some corporate job that paid better and didn't involve watching history slowly rot because the city council couldn't find funding. The sound of a truck backing up to the loading dock cut through the ambient noise of rain on the metal roof, and Bridget heard the beeping warning signal that heavy vehicles made when reversing, and she stood up and walked over to the roll-up door, figuring it was probably facilities management delivering more boxes of documents for her to store improperly. She grabbed the chain and hauled the door up, and the gray daylight flooded in along with the sound of rain. And Gideon was standing in the bed of his white city forestry truck looking down at her, the signed work order for materials transport visible through the windshield. And the entire truck bed was loaded with massive rough-cut slabs of raw wood. He wasn't holding flowers or showing up with some romantic gesture. He was in his work clothes covered in sawdust despite the rain, and he was holding a cordless power drill in one hand and a carpenter's framing square in the other. And the truck bed behind him was stacked with cedar planks that looked like they'd been freshly milled, the wood still showing chainsaw marks and bark on the edges. "I can't fight the city council, Bridget, and I can't buy you a better building or magically fix your funding situation," Gideon said. And he jumped down from the truck bed and set his tools on the concrete. "But cedar wood naturally repels moisture and prevents rot. It's why they use it for outdoor decking and closets. And I know how to build custom elevated shelving that'll get these boxes off the wet floor." I submitted a formal maintenance request Thursday morning, listing myself as installing contractor under my city employee credentials, and the cedar is approved salvage under Parks Department reclamation policy. Your supervisor fast-tracked the paperwork because the alternative was watching the archives flood. We have a signed work order as long as we're done by Monday. Bridget was just standing there trying to process why he was here after she'd explicitly told him she needed space, and she looked at the cedar planks and then at his face. "Gideon, I told you I didn't have anything to give right now. I'm watching my entire career dissolve in a damp warehouse, and I don't have the energy to be a functional person, let alone a functional girlfriend." Her voice came out more raw than she intended, and Gideon set down the drill and walked over to stand in front of her, close enough that she could smell the rain and sawdust on his clothes. "I'm not here because I need you to perform being okay. I'm here because yesterday my crew removed a hazard tree in Laurelhurst and the city was going to chip the whole thing for mulch. But it was old-growth cedar, and I got permission to mill it for personal use instead. Spent yesterday afternoon after my shift cutting it into planks," Gideon said, and he pulled a box of heavy-duty structural screws from his jacket pocket and held it out to her. "You don't have to save history all by yourself. Now help me hold this frame steady because these planks weigh about 80 pounds each, and I'm not trying to drop one on my foot." Something in Bridget's defensive wall cracked. Seeing him standing there in the rain with a truck full of lumber he'd personally milled, offering her the most practical form of help she could imagine, and she took the box of screws and followed him to the truck. They spent the next 20 minutes unloading cedar planks, and Gideon had brought way more than she'd expected, probably 20 boards in various lengths, and he'd also brought metal brackets and a level and a chalk line and a battery-powered circular saw. I measured the facility from the outside and did rough calculations. If we build 5 rows of shelving along that back wall, we can get everything elevated at least 2 feet off the floor. Cedar shelves with air circulation underneath, Gideon said while he was chalking reference lines on the concrete. They worked through the entire morning without stopping, and the physical labor of it was demanding in a way that felt almost therapeutic, lifting heavy planks and holding them level while Gideon drilled pilot holes and drove screws into the concrete walls using masonry anchors. The cedar smelled incredible, this rich, woody scent that filled the warehouse and covered up the mildew, and Bridget's arms were shaking from holding boards steady. But she didn't complain, because this was the first time in weeks she'd felt like she was actually doing something productive, instead of just watching disasters unfold in slow motion. Around noon, Finn showed up with Gideon's sister dropping him off, and the kid had a paper bag with sandwiches, and he set up camp on a stack of empty pallets to eat lunch and watch them work. "Dad said you're building shelves for old maps. Can I help, or do I have to just sit here?" Finn asked, and Gideon looked at Bridget, who nodded, and they put Finn on the job of organizing screws by size and handing them the drill bits when they needed to swap sizes. By 2 p.m., they'd completed the first row of shelving, 5 sections running 20 feet along the back wall, and they started moving boxes onto the elevated cedar platforms, and Bridget could immediately see the difference. The documents up off the cold, damp concrete with air circulation underneath. Though Gideon told her the green planks would shift as they dried over the next few weeks, and he'd build extra tolerance into the brackets to account for it. They worked until it was getting dark outside, and the warehouse lights made everything look harsh and industrial. And Gideon was teaching Bridget how to properly countersink screws so the shelf surfaces were smooth, and Finn had fallen asleep on a pile of drop cloths in the corner. "We got 3 rows done today. If I come back tomorrow, we can finish the other 2. Get everything elevated by end of weekend," Gideon said, and he was rolling his shoulders, trying to work out the muscle fatigue. Bridget was sitting on the floor with her back against one of the new shelves, and her hands had blisters from holding the level, and her arms felt like they'd been through a workout. But she also felt more solid than she had in weeks. "Why are you doing this? You could be home resting or spending time with Finn. Instead, you're in a warehouse building furniture for my job that doesn't pay you," Bridget said, and Gideon sat down next to her. "Because watching you try to carry this whole situation alone when I have skills that could actually help felt wrong, and because cedar was just going to get mulched anyway, might as well turn it into something that preserves history instead of wasting it." He said it simply like it was the most obvious choice in the world, and Bridget leaned her head on his shoulder, and they just sat there in the sawdust breathing the cedar smell, while Finn snored softly in the background. Sunday they finished the remaining 2 rows and spent another 3 hours moving all the archival boxes onto the elevated shelves. And by the time they were done, the warehouse had been completely transformed. The cedar shelving running along the back wall in 5 neat rows, creating a storage system that looked almost professional. And more importantly, the documents were off the wet floor with proper air circulation. Gideon's sister picked up Finn around 4, and Bridget and Gideon did a final walkthrough, checking that everything was stable and properly anchored. And the building still wasn't climate controlled, and it still wasn't ideal, but it was dramatically better than cardboard boxes sitting directly on damp concrete. "I need to pay you for the materials, the screws and the brackets at least. How much do I owe you?" Bridget asked while they were packing up tools, and Gideon shook his head. "The cedar was free salvage. I had most of the brackets and some hardware left over from other projects. Only had to buy about $25 in extra screws, and I'm not charging you for any of it. This was a free date weekend, just on a larger scale." Bridget looked at him and realized that in 2 days of hard physical labor, he'd managed to save her career and her sanity without spending more than $25 on materials. And that said more about who he was than any expensive gesture ever could. 6 months later in early September, Bridget was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor of the Marine Drive facility, carefully sliding a restored 1920 city planning map into an acid-free protective sleeve. And the warehouse smelled rich and earthy. This permanent cedar scent that had become as familiar as her basement office at City Hall used to smell. The archival boxes were organized on the hand-built shelving, looking almost official, and she'd gotten the city to spring for a proper industrial dehumidifier after she'd submitted a report showing the dramatic improvement in document preservation since the cedar installation. A few feet away, Gideon was sitting on the floor leaning against one of the support posts, and Finn was next to him, and they were sharing a crumpled bag of store-brand potato chips while Finn explained his latest beetle discovery from a field trip. They hadn't spent money on a date in 10 months, had built an entire relationship on free walking trails and sitting in truck beds in warehouse work sessions, and Bridget had learned that financial security wasn't something you bought or subscribed to. It was something you built with your hands using whatever materials were available. She looked at the sturdy cedar shelves holding a century of city history, wood that had been destined for a chipper 6 months ago, but instead got turned into preservation infrastructure. And she realized that most valuable things in life weren't the ones you purchased. They were the ones you repaired together.